It became a very unattractive thing, particularly for women, to wear because it was this kind of symbol of quite conservative notion.
Fashions that came in really symbolised this moment of hope and optimism and abundance across the continents.
We're recording history and looking back at history. Maybe we're not projecting the future.
People will, fashion will always win. Fashion's this kind of need for self-adornment, and it's also, I think, very much about optimism.
Halo semuanya, selamat sore. Saya Margaret Tauntoro atau Marji, Chief Community Officer dari Majalah Dewi. Hari ini akan memandu sesi Jakarta Fashion Week Come for Fashion dengan tema Navigating Fashion Post-Crisis Through the Eyes of History. Di mana hari ini kita akan ngobrol bareng tamu-tamu istimewa dari The Victoria and Albert Museum London atau yang biasa kita kenal dengan The V&A. The Victoria and Albert Museum sendiri didirikan pada tahun 1852 dan namanya diambil dari nama Ratu Victoria dan Pangeran Albert. Sebelum kita masuk ke sesi dengan panelis kita, mari kita lihat film berikut untuk sedikit lebih mengenal The V&A. Kita semua sudah lihat sekilas tentang The V&A dari video yang sudah ditayangkan tadi. Berbicara tentang fashion, The V&A sendiri memiliki koleksi fashion yang paling komprehensif di Inggris yang mencakup periode lebih dari 5.000 tahun. Mulai dari masa pre-dynasty Mesir hingga hari ini. Lebih dari 75.000 objek, baik individu maupun set, dirawat secara bersamaan oleh Asian Department dan juga The Furniture, Textiles, and Fashion Department. Objek-objek ini berasal dari area geografis yang luas dan mencakup Eropa, Asia Selatan, Asia Tenggara, Asia Timur, Asia Tengah, Timur Tengah, Afrika, dan juga Amerika. Kita akan berbincang lebih jauh tentang The V&A, adaptasi mereka di saat pandemi, juga berdiskusi tentang fashion dan sejarah perjalanannya dalam melewati beragam krisis seperti perang, isu sosial, dan juga pandemi. I will invite our guests from the V&A Museum. Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon from our side. How are you guys?
Very well, thank you.
Good to have you guys here. Okay, perhaps you can all introduce yourself briefly to the audience and tell them about your role in the V&A so they get to know you guys better. We can start from Sonette.
Yes, hi, I'm Sonette Stanfill. I'm Senior Curator of Fashion at the museum, and I work with our collections of 20th and 21st century fashion. And I'm just delighted to be here with you today to talk a little bit about what we do, which is a range of projects, including exhibitions. And on the screen, on the top, you see two images from a show that I curated a few years ago called The Glamour of Italian Fashion, looking at 20th and 21st century Italian fashion design. And on the bottom, a couple of images from a show that Oriel and I worked on together about British evening wear called Ball Gowns from 2012. And so we're just really pleased to be here with you today to talk a little bit more about the range of fashion programs that we put on and what that entails within the museum.
Thank you. This is so lovely. And we can move to Dr. Christine.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Christine Chikinska. I am the curator of African and African diaspora fashion. It's a fairly new role for me. I started in June, so I'm very much the new girl on the block today. The images on the screen show one historical ensemble, or it's a group of ensembles by a historical African designer, Kofi Ansah, so quite typical of the sort of historical pieces that I'm researching, and then a contemporary piece by Stella Jean, which some of you will recognise, the striker coat and patterned trousers. So my role is very much to widen our reach in terms of our collection so that we can start collecting more contemporary fashions from Africa and its diasporas. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And then we have Josephine.
Hi everyone, my name's Josephine Rout. I'm a curator in the Asian department, where we also have a wonderful collection of fashion from all over Asia. I specialize in Japan, particularly modern and contemporary Japanese fashion, and I was project curator for Kimono Kyoto to Catwalk, in which we showed not just kimono, but kimono-inspired fashion. So on the screen here, you see on the left a shot from the exhibition, which really draws together contemporary kimono fashion. In the middle, we have this great example of a collaboration between a Japanese kimono brand and a Norwegian-based designer, Team Michael. And on the left, we have a recent graduate from Britain, Milligan Beaumont, who's someone who is very inspired by Japan, and that's very much kind of, I'm very interested in this and have included it because she's it's very much part of this kind of Japan's Cool Japan initiative that's encouraged her interest. Thank you.
Very interesting, thank you. And last but not least, we have Oriel.
Hello, I'm Oriel Cullen and I'm curator of modern textiles and fashion. I work with contemporary fashion quite a lot, and as you can see in these images, one of the initiatives that I work on is Fashion in Motion, and this is a program where we engage with contemporary designers to showcase their collections within the museum setting. So we ask them to create something new, whether it be a sort of mini retrospective or a theme from throughout their work, and we show it then a series of live catwalk shows in the museum. And you'll see here we have a beautiful image from Guo Pei, who we worked with last year in November, and she was showing some incredible pieces of her haute couture collections. And then more recently this year, on the other side, you'll see this amazing image of a model inside a bubble. And these are latex garments, which were created by a young designer, Frederick Johansson, who's a graduate of Central St. Martin's. So we like to try and have a very varied program, from well-known international designers to up-and-coming young stars. And I also work on contemporary fashion exhibitions. Most recently, the Christian Dior Designer Dreams show that ran in 2019 from February till September.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And then we can just start with some questions. The first one will be to Sonat. I believe that a lot of our audience here today are already familiar with the astonishing collection from the V&A Museum. A lot of them, I think, has gone to London. But could you give us a brief introduction on the spectrums or the fields that the V&A is focusing on?
Absolutely. Well, you will have seen from the video that there is quite a lot of a range of objects and collections in the museum that span time periods and geographies. And so it really is, while it's not entirely encyclopedic, we do have a very broad reach, which makes it a very exciting place to work. fashion has always featured very prominently in terms of our public program, but of course you will have seen from those images that we have ceramics, glass, sculpture, paintings, works on paper, and from, as I say, quite a wide geography, not just Europe, but Japan, wonderful collections from China, India, and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. And of course, the work that Christine is doing is increasing our range to include Africa and the African diaspora. So it's a very large and broad collection, which allows us to draw upon that material to tell exhibitions and stories, not just in our halls in South Kensington, but of course, we've recently opened outposts in Dundee in Scotland, and also in Shenzhen. So there's a kind of broad also geographical reach in terms of where we show our collections, including the exhibition tours to lending. We lend quite a number of our shows abroad, which keeps us all very busy, and it also extends our brand to museums and locations around the world. So we were very, very active, and as I say, fashion has, I think it's played a very central role increasingly in the last few years, but we've been showing contemporary fashion at the V&A since at least the 1970s, but of course collecting textiles and dress from the very inception in the mid-19th century. So it's very much a kind of cornerstone, fashion is very much a cornerstone of the V&A's public program. And as you will have seen in those images introducing each of us, that includes not just exhibitions, but the Fashion in Motion program, as well as a range of talks for our members, which bring in contemporary designers into the museum for talks and in conversations, which are incredibly popular. So there's a long history of deep connections with the fashion industry and the V&A. And I guess I would add too that because London has on its doorstep some of the most prominent fashion colleges and universities and programs, we also have very strong connections with academic institutions and with makers and practitioners who are earlier in their careers. So that's just a little bit of a taste of kind of what we do, and I'm excited to hear some of the comments of my colleagues with regards to the questions that follow.
Oh, thank you. So we know that some exhibitions had to be canceled completely due to the pandemic. How has the V&A adjusted its operation during this period?
Well, I guess speaking from very recent experience, our exhibition opened in late February and had to close after just over 2 weeks of being open to the public, which was really, really disheartening and very difficult. And so we not only had to, kind of contact all of our lenders and ensure that all of our objects were kind of safely preserved during the time that the museum was closed, but we had to think really quickly about what we could do to kind of continue the exhibition. And so what we were able to do just before the museum closed was make a curator's tour, a series of 5 videos, which we were then able to put online, which not only gave people access to the exhibition, but it really broadened the amount of people who could experience the exhibition. It really, gained us a global audience. So there was a real kind of benefit in being able to do that.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that the recent exhibition, which looks so beautiful in the PPT just now. Tell us more a bit about this exhibition. I mean, how was the process behind the execution, and what was the challenge of moving it to more digital platform? And what do you think? I mean, you said there are benefits of doing it, but how do you adjust that? I mean, I'm sure there are some things missing from the physical side, the dream, the nuance. We were talking about this before, the session started. physical experience move into digital platform, there must be a lot of things to adjust. I mean, can you share a bit, since you're the latest one who experienced this?
So the exhibition, just to give a broad overview, really focuses on the kimono, and it counters this particularly Western notion that it's this timeless traditional garment, by actually showing that it has really rich and sophisticated fashion history, and that it's had a really global impact on fashion, as well as having been influenced by global fashions itself. And we really wanted to do it now because in recent years there's been a huge revival for wearing kimono, both in Japan but also internationally. And a kind of new generation of kimono designers who very much see themselves as fashion designers has emerged. We had also planned this exhibition because, of course, this would have been the year of the Tokyo Olympics, which was postponed. But as I say, we were able to create these films, which was great. But what you really miss by not being able to visit the exhibition is, of course, you miss out on so much of the detail that a lot of these garments have, the incredible embroidery and weaving and dyeing, that with a kind of, even though the camera lingers, it's not the same as being able to actually observe that in the gallery. Also, you miss the ability to kind of be able to explore the exhibition on your own terms. It's very much a curator's tour, and so you're guided by the curator, whereas and it's very limited in time in what can be shown. So a lot of these kind of smaller stories or things we tried to include in the show, that if you were able to walk around with someone, with an hour or two, you could fully explore, but in a video you just can't do that. And then the other thing that we also kind of have had to move online is our public program of events that we had planned to go with the exhibition. So, for example, we were planning a fashion in motion with Oriel and a kimono designer, Jotaro Saito, which wasn't able to happen. And we had also planned an international kind of symposium, which will hopefully now take place online. So some things can't happen, but others have been able to be moved to virtual space.
So everything will be moved online digitally from now onwards. Until when do you think you guys can do a real physical exhibitions and events again?
Well, maybe I might just mention that we're hoping at the moment in London, everything's in lockdown, but we're hoping, our fingers crossed, that in December we will be able to resume physical visits to the museum. And we have an upcoming exhibition which has been postponed twice now, unfortunately due to the pandemic. But we're really hoping, fingers crossed, that this show, which is called Bags Inside Out, and it's curated by our colleague Lucia Savi, hopefully that's going to open on the 12th of December. So we're all looking forward to that.
Oh wow, must be nice. We are in London. So back to Oriel. The COVID-19 pandemic has greatly and vastly changed the way we live our lives. In the past, we have also seen historical events that led to a change in society, which in parallel also influenced a major change in fashion. Do you think the same thing will happen now?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. Again, we always like to sort of slightly sit on the fence of the museum and say, really, as a museum, we're recording history and looking back at history. Maybe we're not projecting the future, but we do work a lot with designers and with people across the fashion community. I think there are sort of two opinions here at the moment talking about contemporary fashion, in that a lot of people are sort of tired of just being at home and not having the chance to dress up. So they're sort of looking forward to a change and maybe re-embracing the fashion world. Other people are saying, you know, they're going to change the way they dress, their habits, you know, looking towards more sustainable approaches to fashion, which of course is something that's very important at the V&A. We recently had a show curated by our colleague Edwina Ehrman, which looked at sustainability in a show called Fashioned from Nature. And that, you know, is something that's great. I think we've all had time to reassess that. So hopefully going forward, you know, there will be a real conscious effort that we look this in this direction. And I think, you know, as you mentioned before, we've seen it with major world events, which have brought in big changes in fashions. So we shall see.
Yeah. So I know you created the Dior's Designer of Dreams exhibition last year, which I went to. Lucky me, it was beautiful. So the new look, Dior's new look, it was born after World War II as kind of like an antithesis or reaction against the lack of materials and to the resulting severity of wartime fashion. Could you elaborate more about this, especially related to the exhibition that you just did, and also with the Dior exhibition that you also curate for the Shanghai one, which was open at the end of July this year, when the whole world is still probably in lockdown, but they're already doing exhibitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's sort of two sort of strands there. I'll speak to the first one about Dior. As you mentioned, you know, the post sort of Second World War era was, you know, really a moment of change. As you said, reacting to the restrictions of wartime fashion, Dior sort of looked towards an alternative way of dressing and really brought in the idea and concept of luxury, you know, using a lot of fabrics in his design, changing a silhouette, you know, to bring in a very exaggerated silhouette where there was full long skirts with a lot more fabric being used, whereas previously during the wartime, you know, skirts were much shorter and slimmer. Also emphasizing the waist, emphasizing the sloping shoulders. So really the silhouette that he introduced, which he based on the idea of an upside down flower, that is really a silhouette that carries throughout the next decade of the 1950s. So it's a sort of reactionary thing to the years of privation and restriction. And I think the world was really ready for something new. And he was launching his design label in 1947 and across the world. And I know in Indonesia too, it was a great time of change in that period. So it was sort of projecting something, a way of dressing for a new future. It was quite a hopeful way of approaching fashion. In Shanghai, that was something that we had hoped to open in May. Obviously, the pandemic hit. And so, as with a number of other V&A exhibitions, which are also traveling, we had to work remotely. So very sadly, we couldn't go to Shanghai, but we had an incredible team on the ground there. And my colleagues at Dior had made some amazing videos in terms of how to dress the mannequins. And we had a film crew on site. So we were sort of every day online, sort of 7 to 10 hour meetings, installing with all of the amazing team in Shanghai. So that was great. And we were delighted that, you know, it had a good reception and lots of people in Shanghai got to see it. So that just closed in October.
Oh, thank you so much, Auriel. I want to move on to probably Christine or Josephine again. I think we believe that in some parts of the world, changes will look different. What happened during the World War II? Can you maybe, based on history, can you tell us a bit about what happened in Asia or in Africa after World War II about in terms of fashion. And can you tell us more about working with contemporary designers from Asia or Africa?
Thank you so much. That's great. Two great questions. I'll go first, I think. I'll jump in. If I think about Africa, if I think about the continent, the moment of historical change was the mid-20th century, so shortly after the Second World War. And for the African continent, that era was very much about independence. So between the mid-1950s to the brink, really, of the 21st century, years after years, decades after decades, saw independence for each of the individual countries in Africa, because remember there are 54 countries. And that, rather as Oriel has said about World War II and the Dior look, the fashions that came in really symbolise this moment of hope and optimism and abundance across the continents. And for Africans, it was a chance to kind of showcase the fashions that were already there, but were maybe sort of powered up by that moment of independence. And it was a time where African designers caught the eye of the rest of the world. So there were designers like Sade Thomas Farm, Kofi Ansah, who was one of the designers featured on my slide earlier. And what many of these designers did, and encouraged by the then newly formed independent governments, they looked back at traditional fabrics like kente or other sort of strip woven fabrics and revisited them to new contemporary aesthetics. So this was absolutely about being modern. It was about telling the world what it was like to be Black and elegant and fashionable and modern through the way that you put yourself together. So a really, really exciting moment, a moment of major change. And I think that that moment still powers up the vibrancy of the contemporary African fashion scene, which for me, it's very much a cosmopolitan, diverse scene. So on the one hand, there are designers that create wonderfully minimalist aesthetics, others that create mixtures of pattern and print and embellishment. So it's very diverse. But I think that that really sort of started in those independence years. So this idea of a cosmopolitan and vibrant African fashion scene came out of that moment of historical change.
Thank you, Christine. And Josephine, do you have any insight about what happened in Asia during that time?
Yeah, so it was really after the Second World War that, particularly in Japan, women really stopped wearing kimono every day. Up until then, it had very much been the kind of dominant mode of dress for women, not necessarily men. But after the war, that's really when almost everyone in Japan started wearing Western clothes. And the kimono kind of stopped being an item of fashion and really became a kind of form of ceremonial costume that was kind of preserved for special occasions, such as kind of coming of age ceremony or weddings. And so that kind of shift from it being, an everyday item of dress that could be really, fashionable and related to global fashion, really stopped. And because it became this kind of ceremonial costume, it then became quite codified, and a lot of kind of rules and etiquette were associated with it. So it became a very unattractive thing, particularly for women to wear, because it was this kind of symbol of quite conservative notions of Japanese femininity. And this kind of continued throughout the 20th century, particularly as Japan's economy recovered, because the focus then became on very, very high-end kimono, very, very expensive silk kimono. that you wouldn't wear every day and had to be tied in these very, very specialist ways. So it's really only in the kind of beginning of the 21st century that we see this revival for kimono as fashion. And that, I think in some part it is a response to the recession that Japan experienced, and young people kind of looking more to vintage clothes. It's also a reaction to the kind of ubiquity of fashion chains and this the kind of globalization of fashion that this kind of new generation started looking at kimono again and started buying vintage kimono from the early 20th century and kind of styling it in a more relaxed way, in an informal but very fashionable way. And as I mentioned earlier, from this kind of fashion revival that really started kind of on the streets, a lot of new designers have come out from that, who have kind of focused on making kimono more accessible by using kind of cotton or polyester, more affordable fabrics, or focusing on techniques like digital printing, again, to make this a less expensive garment. And what's been really sad to see is, a lot of these designers that we showcase in the exhibition were really excited to be featured in our exhibition, but also, for the many events that were kind of going to hopefully come out of that and the Olympics this year. And so much of this has been cancelled because of COVID. So, for example, kimono, whilst people are wearing it kind of casually, it's still tied to a lot of events, and particularly summer festivals for cotton kimono, yukata. And that kind of entire season of summer events of going to see fireworks and things, and all these events that were supposed to be associated with the Olympics have been cancelled. So for, they're all independent designers. That kind of, that business has gone. And so it's been really, really sad to see how hard they have been hit, particularly because the kimono industry is already so fragile. And so any kind of anything like this is really devastating. So that's one sad thing to comment on.
Well, but hopefully the Olympic will be moved to next year. It's going to happen next year, and then people will just go out in their kimonos again to celebrate not just the Olympics but life in general, right?
Exactly.
I think I want to go back to Christine. I have another question. You came into the V&A in June, you said, right?
Yes.
And that was the height of this social movement, the Black Lives Matters. And how has it affected your work and the program in the V&A? And how do you think it affects the fashion generally and globally in the world, or even in Africa itself?
Yes, I think in some ways I need to point out that my arrival in June, at the height of the visibility, if you like, of the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, was purely coincidental. So in fact, I was scheduled, I was offered the post at the start of the year. And I arrive on the back of years of the V&A engaging with African textiles, engaging with African fashions. So my arrival is not solely tied to the Black Lives Matter movement and this summer, but of course my being here at the museum in this extraordinary moment, it's timely, it's necessary, it's vital. And so I want to kind of take this opportunity where the world is looking at issues around race and culture, and use this moment and the fact that as the V&A we have an international voice. And I want to put those two things together and provide a platform where we can start to showcase the work, the wonderful work that has been coming out of the African continent and the African diaspora for decades. So I always see myself almost as part storyteller, part facilitator, and I think that that's what I bring to my role at the V&A, and I think that that's what we do well as an organisation, is to allow conversations to happen in our spaces, and fashion is central to that. So fashion is central to the movement, fashion is central to identity and self-fashioning across the African continent and the African diaspora. And so I think that we provide a space where we can safely explore some of these themes. But I think to tie my arrival too much to Black Lives Matter would be to do what the museum's plans already were a disservice, and almost to do the movement itself a disservice, because the movement has existed for years and I'm sure will carry on existing. But what we have in this extraordinary moment is the world's eyes are on Blackness, Black beauty, Black power, Black elegance, Black creativity. And I think that that is a really welcome moment, and it's something that we can actually play our part in this moment by opening our metaphorical galleries at the moment, our digital galleries, if you like, and our spaces and our website, open that up for further discussion and to invite voices that perhaps don't always come to the museum, allow those voices to be present and heard within our framework.
I might just could I just add to something that Christine just said, if that's all right?
Sure. Yeah.
Which is, I just wanted to comment on the kind of the link to the international that Christine's reply was kind of referencing, the link to other parts of the world. And I think that's partly why we're just so delighted to be on the Jakarta Fashion Week program, which is that our connections to beyond London are framed not just through our exhibitions, which do travel to other venues, but they're also those links are established through the research that we do for those exhibitions, which usually includes hosting roundtable discussions, now so much more easily facilitated through platforms like Zoom, but with academics and researchers, but also makers, fashion designers, creative practitioners from around the world. We take that kind of work very seriously, and we enjoy establishing those networks as part of our approach, as part of our work approach. So I think it's an element of our work that we're continuing to expand on through also a range of education programs that, for example, Oriel has been working for the last few years on a fashion and dress curation course for professionals already in the field, already established, who have come to London from all around the world to work with us, and for us also to learn from them about creative practice in curation and different approaches. So that's another example of links to people from around the world that we're trying to further and establish, that makes our jobs just that much more interesting, but it also creates a two-way exchange with institutions, with fashion designers from all over the world, that kind of continues to make sure that we hope to be always at the top of our game, but always expanding those networks.
Absolutely. And I would say that one of the positive sides of the coronavirus situation and everything being digital is that even in the short time that I've been with the team, I've been able to hold workshops and roundtables with experts, whether they're practitioners or academics, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Canada, in the States, across the States, South Africa. And so there's this already a wonderful richness that we've been able to move to the digital platform that allows us to do even more of the kinds of engagements that Sonnet has touched on.
And just to add on that, for Kimono, we worked really closely with our colleagues in Japan, with the institutions such as the Kyoto Costume Institute and the Tokyo National Museum, who we borrowed from. But we also brought over a curator from Bunka Gakuen, which is Japan's leading fashion college, who worked with us on the kimono styling, because it was really important for us that we worked as much as we could with Japanese colleagues, to show that, as Sonnet says, we learn from them as well. It's really important to engage as many people as possible with our work. So just, but that was in the days where we could bring people to the museum.
Well, we have Zoom now, so everyone can just, we
I
can.
know. And I have hope that one day these things might be able to happen again. I think we can be optimistic to some extent.
Yeah, about working with the local figures like other museums or experts, I find it how do you decide who to work with, or what things that you should focus on? Like, let's say in the Dior Shanghai exhibition, I know that you put in a lot of artworks from Chinese artists. Can you tell us more about the reason behind that, or why do you think it's important to do that, and the relation to the ongoing exhibition itself, Auriel?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with a lot of our shows, we tend, when we travel the shows, this is sort of speaking separately about V&A exhibitions particularly, we tend to adjust them to the location that they're going to. So the institution that they will be shown in, or the space that they'll be shown in, the locality, we tend to work with curators from that area often, and have a part of the show that relates to local creatives, local designers, or local collections. So to really shape the message to an audience, that they can connect. And I think that's very important. With the Dior show, that actually, the Dior show began life in Paris, and it was curated there by Olivier Gabet and Florence Muller. And when it was in Paris, it had quite a large art component to it, because Christian Dior was originally an art gallerist. When it came to London, we had a smaller space to show it in, so we decided to focus on the fashion. The wonderful thing about the Shanghai show was that we once again had a very big space to work with. So it was fantastic that we were able to include more art pieces. And Dior has, quite a relationship, specifically since 2008. They've worked with a lot of Chinese artists. And so it was a really lovely opportunity to show a lot of works that had been created by artists inspired by the Dior collections and Christian Dior himself. So it was really great to be able to look at those artworks and include the works of those artists in that show.
Okay, next I want to ask to actually all of you. Looking back at the history of post-crisis fashion, how do you think after the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think people will dress up? I know Auriel has already answered this part a bit, but maybe everyone has a different, kind of answer. Do you think we will see more people going towards the dressing down in the next couple of years, with all the sweatpants and loungewears? I know I don't dress up in sweatpants all day. Or is it the other way around, where everyone will want to go all out and just dress up and celebrate?
Well, maybe I'll just dive in to that question. I really liked Auriel's crafty reply by saying that museums do try to kind of take the long view of history and not predict. But I think history has shown us that the pendulum swings, always swings back. So just like the post-war Dior's kind of embrace of extravagance and more fabric was a sort of reaction against wartime restrictions. I think that in the future, people will, fashion will always win. Fashion's this kind of need for self-adornment, and it's also, I think, very much about optimism. It's a very optimistic enterprise, this notion that you can always recreate yourself through your attire. And so I think fashion won't be denied, and I think you'll see that it won't be just sweatpants. I can't imagine anyone wanting to wear yoga clothes in a few months' time. They'll want to burn it, I think, out in the front of their house. So I think the pendulum will swing back, but as Oriel said, there's no question that we are thinking about fashion in a different way in terms of its impact on the planet, in terms of responsible and ethical methods of production and treatment of workers. All of this is very front of mind. And so I think very much focused on how fashion is produced and how it's, and what it's made of is going to continue to be absolutely at the center of the conversation.
I agree. For me, I think that there'll be more of a sort of mindful approach to shopping and the consumption of fashion. For me, that I think will be the main change, whether that manifests itself in sharing or in exchange, or there are many of these sort of rental outlets now. So I think maybe that will become more prevalent. So potentially we may buy less, which is not necessarily what the industry wants to hear, but I suspect that that is the way forward. And also I find myself wondering the way in which we've all been encouraged to take exercise by walking. I wonder whether that might herald in the idea of the kind of historical promenade or the liming that you have in the Caribbean, where you put your finest things on and you walk. Or in Italy, in Italian fashion, there is that moment, having worked for Italian brands, there is that moment where people do get dressed up and stroll around the square. So I wonder whether that might return post-COVID, which is a lovely thought, I think.
I also agree that I really hope that that people do, the one thing that will continue is this focus and growing concern for sustainability and where and how our clothes are made. I hope that's one thing that continues. But what I have noticed is that creativity continues. The amazing things I've seen being done online during these times of lockdown has been really heartening. And I think also it's hard for me because I'm older, but the kind of younger generation are far more used to dressing up online, for Instagram. And so well, for many of us, the thought of being at home is just dressing down. That's not necessarily the case for younger people. So I think it's hard to kind of see it as this going out and staying in, where for some people that divide doesn't necessarily exist in that way. And to go back to kimono, which I feel like often do, what has been quite interesting to see is because people at least do have a little more time, it is quite a time-consuming process of dressing, and it is something you have to kind of learn how to do. So I think I have seen people kind of spending this time, studying YouTube tutorials on how to tie an obi and spending that time, kind of putting kimono ensembles together and trying it out. So at least having this time to kind of think more about how we dress and what we wear, rather than kind of shopping for the sake of it because we're bored and just getting dressed in a hurry because we've got to go to work. So I hope that we'll have still incredible creativity, perhaps more so, and more considered ways of dressing.
I might just add to Josephine's point about dressing for online moments, because one of the objects that we recently acquired is a J.W. Anderson cardigan, which was worn on the Today Show by the singer Harry Styles, and obviously it spawned millions of amazing TikTok copies and videos, and the pattern was then made available on the J.W. Anderson website. So, that's a great example of people, taking an approach to dressing up at home, but also very sustainable as well. That idea that you're creating it yourself and sort of engaging with the garments. So we've been really pleased to see, the TikTok videos and that different approach to dressing up while at home.
That's interesting. Maybe in the future we will see an exhibition about 2020 where people dress up at home. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions that came in. I'm going to read a few of them. So what kind of impact or influence that the Japanese culture bring to the people in the UK nowadays?
So what's been really interesting to see is while Japan and UK have quite a long relationship, and UK has had quite a strong interest in Japan, particularly from the late 19th century. What I'm very interested in, have been observing, is how Japanese pop culture has kind of grown and developed in the UK, and that is largely to the impact of the Cool Japan initiative, which was a government-sponsored program to promote Japanese culture, particularly pop culture, abroad. It was a way of kind of trying to harness what they call soft power to gain kind of cultural influence. And it really has been very successful in the UK, but also elsewhere. And that's been through things like Hyper Japan, which is this very large convention that brings together, a whole host of elements of not just pop culture, but just Japanese culture in general, kimono included. And as I mentioned, the designer Milligan Beaumont, I very much see she's someone who's kind of grown up during this time of Japan's promotion of pop culture, and is very very interested in Japan, despite the fact that she hasn't actually been able to visit Japan. And I particularly find this quite interesting in relation to these kind of discussions about cultural appropriation, which of course are very central to our exhibition, and what it means for people to wear kimono or kimono-inspired garments, and how that's really changed, and I think will continue to change. While I think there are some very kind of clear examples of blatant cultural appropriation, in which kind of dominant powers are exploiting others for financial gain. The kimono is a bit more complex because, and Japan in general, because in a lot of these kind of situations, Japan has actually had a lot of agency in how its culture is received and kind of interpreted, and very much in this case with Cool Japan, Japan is actively encouraging this interest in Japan, and encouraging kind of work like Milligan's. So I think Japan and kimono kind of complicate this these discussions.
Thank you, Josephine, for the explanation. I hope that explains Hattie for the questions. And we have another question from Axel. From working in fashion over the years, especially that you're all now working at the V&A, I believe you have seen lots of fashion pieces from Paris designers. I'm wondering if sustainability has been present since the earliest work of fashion designers, and how do you think sustainability changed or evolved, seeing from the work of predecessors in fashion compared to current designers?
I think it's really interesting to look back at processes and making, and this is something that also maybe Christine, we spoke a bit about the approach of makers in a lot of African countries too, that often unconsciously, traditionally, a lot of processes were not environmentally unfriendly. They were sustainable, thinking of the handmade garment, thinking of the sort of local tailoring. It's only really recently that we have this crisis. And I think it is, definitely a crisis in the last 20 years where we are producing billions of tons of clothing. We're all expecting to have, many more clothes in our wardrobes and at much more affordable prices. So I think the mass fashion, while it's been a sort of very much mass production starting in the 19th century, but really gearing up in the 20th, it is a 21st century crisis. So I think when you look back, you can see aspects of sustainability at play in design, but it was never really to the forefront or the focus until the end of the 20th century. We get designers to really start considering that. How their holistic approach is affecting the environment. And very much, it was a difficult thing because I think it got pigeonholed early on, and people sort of thought, well, that's not really fashion. But you see people like Stella McCartney, who was probably the most sort of well-known name at the forefront of this, really, gearing up and since the beginning of the 21st century, always putting that front and center in her work. So I think, as a mass movement, it's only really now, sort of at the end of the road, when we're running out of time, that we're realizing the importance of that. So I would say, in the last 20 years, that Stella McCartney has been at the vanguard. And there are other designers who've been looking at this. Now we have amazing younger designers, people like Bethany Williams, also, Mother of Pearl, lots, so many, I think every young brand that we sort of engage with at the moment, sustainability is really at the core. So I would say that there is, it's quite a complicated story, really, that there are within practices, and particularly within the haute couture and handmade, evidence of sustainability and sustainable approach. And I think, that's a sort of, it would be great to go offline and have a more in-depth conversation with the person who sent that great question in. But I hope that sort of refers to it a little.
I have one question to all of you. I think, what do you think about fashion as a political statement? How close do you think is connection between fashion and politics, especially seeing this year with all the the movement and what's happening globally? How do you think it will be reflected in fashion going forward?
Well, I think I just might mention, I think that's a really interesting question because not so long ago in pre sort of COVID times, we did have lots of discussion and debate about whether it was really the place of fashion brands to be making political statements, and some, advertising situations where things really went wrong. I think that's interesting. Maybe the bigger brands are sort of more cautious now of engaging with that. But I think with a lot of independent designers, last year we had the fortune to work with a Mexican designer, Carla Fernandez. And she's an incredible designer who really puts the idea of sort of politics and also sustainability at the heart of her brand. You know, she sort of makes the point that fashion, she feels, is not ephemeral. You know, you're creating something, it's going to stick around, and you should have the opinion that you take care of it and look after it. But also, what is the message in what you're sending out? The clothing you're wearing, you know, that your sort of whole approach really. And she works very closely with Indigenous communities throughout Mexico to sort of support their own sort of handicraft and artisanal ways of working to produce these amazing garments. But she has a very strong message too, and you know, that idea that we need to sort of en masse take a look at what we're doing and try and change things politically for the better for people through the way we approach our clothing. But I don't know if any of my colleagues have any thoughts on that. Well, Sonnet, you're on mute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sonnet?
I was just going to quickly just add to that.
Yeah, please.
With a little bit of a historic perspective, which is that certainly in Europe, one of the early kind of instances of a surge towards sustainability was through a desire to protect animals, because fashion, of course, has always looked to the natural world for materials, and notoriously fur and feathers have been, you know, always of interest, and there's always been an appetite to adorn oneself with elements from the animal kingdom. And so in Britain in the 19th century, the kind of early examples of sustainability were these protests and movements towards protecting birds from extinction, because ladies' tastes for hats adorned with plumes taken from birds, which involved killing masses of species to the point of extinction. So there were very early examples of this kind of desire to protect the environment through protest and through, in a way, you could call it a political movement, which carried on obviously into the 20th century's campaigns, anti-fur campaigns, which were very successful. So I think sustainability isn't new, as you say, and it's, I think, always interesting to look back to precedents in history where people have assessed the impact of their appetites and of their desire for style and taken decisions about changing their behaviors as a result.
Thank you so much. So I think our time is almost up, and it's been really, really nice talking to you guys. It's an amazing conversation, a lot of new insights and things to ponder on. So we're gonna end this session here today. Thank you so much for being with us. Hopefully we'll have more sessions in the future with the V&A. And thank you everyone for tuning in this afternoon. If you want to know more about the V&A, you can visit the V&A's website on www.vam.ac.uk. And if you want to know more about Jakarta Fashion Week and Dewi Magazine, you can visit our website, social media and apps. Okay, stay safe everyone, stay well, and see you on our next Jakarta Fashion Week Contra Fashion. Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye
you.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.